Hey everybody, welcome to the second video in my network automation series, and today we're going to do our first set of Ansible playbooks. Now if you haven't watched my first video, I highly encourage you to go back and take a look at it. It's going to show you some of the things I did as far as getting the environment set up, how to use Visual Studio Code to connect into this jump host, and finally, just some things about SSH keys, getting software installed. We're going to need Python 3 pip, and we're going to need the Ansible and Ansible PyLib SSH modules that come from pip. But it's going to show you how to get all of that started, kind of get your environment stood up, and just having a kind of foundation for the things you're going to see today. We're going to work exclusively out of Visual Studio Code on this automation jump host to do everything, and I'm going to show you how you can build some simple playbooks, your Ansible config, and your inventory files so that you can work with the devices. In the lab today, we're going to have a Catalyst 8000V router that's connected to a WAN NAT connector. So it's just an external connector in Cisco Modeling Labs that's set up as a NAT bridge. We have this LAN external connector that's just providing a IP address off my home network so that I can connect into the jump host. This Cat 8000V is doing DHCP to the WAN connector, so I just have DHCP set up. The interface is no shut. I have this link between the two that's just set up as a point-to-point interface so I can provide an IP address, and that's just so we have some things to look at when we're doing our show commands. I want to show you, how to write your show commands, or even just use the modules in Ansible to work with the devices. Want to show you some things that might be misconceptions about how you can use the modules, or things that could get you in trouble potentially when you're using the modules, because show commands are common across some of the devices, but maybe they don't work the way we think. And it's important to make sure you understand, when you're working with iOS XE devices and NXOS devices, there are differences between the two platforms, and so you should make sure you're writing your playbooks accordingly. So I'll show you how you can do that and how you can work around having different systems in your environment. And we're going to look at how you display output and actually view data from the Ansible commands. So let's go ahead and start working on our automation jump host. We're going to move over to Visual Studio Code and get connected to the device. Let's go over there. Okay, we're in Visual Studio Code now, and again, if you haven't watched video 1, I talk about how you set up remote connections with remote SSH. I'm using method 2 of that last video, where I showed you how to set up Ubuntu with a single LAN IP from your home network, and then set up a second interface off that Ubuntu host where you can use any private IP address space you want to connect to the management interfaces of your CML hosts. So that's what I've done here. If I click Connect Current Window to Host, I've configured my SSH hosts using this command here. We have this automation jump host, which is the device that I have running inside Cisco Modeling Labs. The username and password, or I should say the username and the IP address for that host have been defined here, along with this common name of automation jump host. And I've pushed an SSH key to automation jump host so that I have passwordless SSH to the device. So again, I click this, it's going to start loading. I can come here to explore, I can open a folder, and at no point was I prompted for a password. So if yours isn't set up, or you want to get your Visual Studio Code to work the way I just did this, go ahead and check out that first video, and it'll walk you through all of those steps for configuring out the CML environment, the way we're using it, and getting your VS code set up to connect to the device. What we're going to do here now is we're going to get started with working with Ansible. And to do that, we're going to just make sure we've got Ansible here. So it's already installed from the last video that we did. And so I have Ansible running here, and I've got a couple different options here. Today we're going to do show commands on the device. We're not going to do any kind of configuration. We just want to look at how we can see different things on the device, how we can show interfaces, maybe show version, maybe show run, and see what happens when we do those things in Ansible. As we work through subsequent videos, we'll start doing some configuration, but I wanted to start with, how we do show commands, because a lot of people still go to the CLI to do show commands, and doing it in Ansible is possible, it's just different. There's some value to doing it through Ansible, and I definitely want to show you those things and why it's valuable. But we have our stuff here, and in order to get started with building out some Ansible, we need to create a directory. And we're going to start with calling it make dir show commands, and that's going to be where we build our playbook. So we're going to go into show commands. There's nothing in here right now. The first thing we need to do is build out an inventory for the devices we're going to use in our Ansible playbooks. And what we're going to do is we're going to create this inventory directory. And this is just about organization. You're going to see me create directories for different things as I go out throughout the series. This is just good habits to get into. I like to have an inventory file or directory. So if I have more than one inventory file, or I want to have things specific to the inventory, there's a folder for them. Under that inventory file, we're going to cd to it. And we're going to do touch inventory.yaml. Now obviously I did this all through the command line, and it's really just to show you how to use Linux to build those files. I could have come over here and I could have made a directory from Visual Studio Code. I could have done new file, but I want to show you some Linux commands because you've never worked with Linux or you're trying to get more experience with Linux. I want to show you some of the ways that you can create directories, create files using Linux. But what I'm not going to do is use VI. I want to actually go in here and take advantage of what VS Code is giving me in terms of an editor and build my inventory out. So an inventory file has some structure to it to help us define the groupings within the playbooks and the hosts that we're going to connect to. And at the top level of every inventory file, you have this all key. And all is saying that everything underneath of here is something that you could run playbooks against. Now, if you put anything here, it could be router switches, it could be NXOS, it could be iOS, it could be iOS XR, it could be Arista, it could be anything. Whatever you put in here, if you run a playbook against all of the devices will try to execute that playbook. Now, because I mentioned different vendors in there, if you had a mix of vendors and some of the commands weren't supported or the modules weren't supported, you're going to get errors in your playbook because they're not valid devices for those modules, or maybe the commands won't run. So there's ways to group your files, or I should say your hosts inside the inventory file. And the way we do that is with this children key, and then we come down and we start building out our groups. I have a Cat 8000V router and I have a Nexus 9000 switch. For this, I'm going to create a group called routers, and I'm going to create another group called switches. Now, I have these two unique groups now. I can come down and I can do my first host. You'll notice that I'm keeping some consistent spacing between my lines. That's a requirement of YAML. So for every tier that I go down, I'm doing 2 spaces. So I have 2 spaces for children, I have 2 spaces for routers. It's very important to know that this is not a tab, this is 2 spaces. So I just did 2 spaces, I need to delete it, put it back there. For routers, I'm going to do 2 spaces to indicate this is my next level down for hosts. Under here, I'm going to define my first host. So we have the CAKV internet router. That's our host name. We're going to come down and we're going to define some attributes, some key value pairs for the things that we want this host to know about for our configuration. And what we're going to do is we're going to define an Ansible host, and we're going to do the IP address of 172.16.1.101. And then we're going to do the Ansible_network_OS of iOS. Now, this is an iOS XE device. It works for both traditional iOS platforms or iOS XE, because the command sets are generally the same. So when you do iOS XE devices, the one you're going to select for Network OS is iOS. For switches, we're going to come down and we're going to do our spacing, do our hosts, and then we're going to do n9kv-sw1, and we're going to do 172.16.1.102. Ansible_host, and then Ansible network OS NXOS. So now, if you look at this, you could say, hey, we have some differentiation between our two network OSs. I have iOS, I have NXOS. Is that enough to differentiate how the modules are going to run? And we'll take a look at that, let you kind of think about whether that may be the case or not, or if it'll just run as is. I mean, I've kind of alluded to the fact that it should run, but we'll actually see it when we write our playbook. The last thing we need to do is we need to come up here and we need to create a vars key, and we need to add this Ansible_connection key, and we need to set it to ansible.netcommon.network_CLI. This Ansible connection network CLI tells the system that this is not just a traditional SSH to our host. We're going to use this netcommon network CLI framework to do our SSH. And if you don't have this here and you try to SSH your device, you're going to have a bad day. It actually throws errors saying can't SSH to the device. And this will kind of be an indication that your Ansible connection is not set up right. So make sure you have that set up when you're working with network devices. If you have a mix of devices, you may want to move this variable somewhere else. You could move it down to a variable under routers or switches. But this is our inventory file. This is everything we need to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and save it. And now we're going to go ahead and build the next thing, which is our Ansible configuration file. So to build our Ansible configuration file, we're going to want to come back to this show commands folder, and we're going to click here and we're going to do new file. And you can see that we're into the show commands folder, show commands folder. We see our inventory. We should be at this first tier of show commands, and I'm just going to do ansible.cfg. It's important to make sure that the Ansible config file is at the top level of where you're working with your playbooks. You want to make sure it's not sitting in inventory. It's sitting where it should be in this show commands directory, and we'll do it to ls. There's only inventory there. We'll go back. We can see Ansible config is there. I'm going to come back to the editor. I already have a couple things pre-configured, and that is the defaults that I want to set for how my playbooks run. Now the first line says inventory, and I'm saying inventory equals current working directory inventory.yaml. What this is saying is that when you run the playbook, use inventory/inventory.yaml as your default playbook. You could have other files in your inventory, but you have to call those using a -i command when you run your playbook and specify that I want to run it on this specific inventory. This inventory.yaml setting, or I should say this inventory default, says that this is going to be my inventory YAML that I use when I run my playbooks by default. So unless I use -i and use something very specific, this is what you should always run. The second line is not something I recommend that you do in production, and that's host key checking. If we come down here and we try to do an SSH right now to netadmin at 172.16.1.101, we're going to see that the fingerprint for those devices has not been accepted. I haven't logged into them yet. I should log into them and get the key. Like, that's just good security practice. But, if you're just kind of working and tooling around inside Cisco Modeling Labs and you're just trying to, understand how Ansible's working, for testing purposes, for experimenting, doing host key checking false is okay. Just don't do it in production. You want to make sure that the devices you are connecting to have a valid host key, and if they don't, then you go back, you check the host key, because there's lots of reasons why that could have changed. For testing purpose, okay, just make sure you're checking your host keys and being security conscious when you're working with your network devices. The last line, which is not going to have an effect right away, but is something I'll show you as we build some of the playbooks throughout this video, is display skipped hosts. We're setting this to false. I don't want to see hosts that I've skipped, when you start building larger playbooks and you start getting into conditionals where you do things that say, hey, if it's this set of devices, do this. If it's this set of devices, do that. The playbook may still try to execute or say, hey, I skipped this device because it didn't match this conditional. All of those skipped devices would show up in the playbook, whether it ran or not. It would just say skipped. By doing display underscore skipped host false, you're saying don't show me that skipped host, just show me the ones that were okay or changed and then move on. You will still see the skipped hosts that, in the final output of the Ansible, which we'll look at, but it just removes the clutter as it runs and reduces the amount of, verbosity and things that are showing up in the output. So it's just a good thing to have. You can leave this set to true just so you can see some of the things, but as you start building bigger playbooks, you start working with more devices. It's something that I usually do as a default, is just display skipped hosts. But this is a good setup for just a couple things that we want to have in our Ansible config, and we're going to go ahead and save this. And now we're going to work with our first playbook. We're actually going to write the first playbook now, and we're in this show commands directory. I'm just going to do new, and we're going to call this show commands.yaml. Actually, I'm going to call it, we're going to show version.yaml. And we can see we're in show commands, show version.yaml. At the top, we're going to do these 3 lines to indicate it's a YAML file or the start of a YAML file, and we're going to do hosts all. So we're going to run this against all of the hosts on our CML host. Everything that's in our inventory, we're just going to run it. We're going to do gather underscore facts, and we're going to set that to false. Gather facts works really well for traditional Linux hosts, things that are not network devices. The network modules generally have their own gather facts, like NXOS facts or iOS facts, that if you want to gather facts from the device, you could use that instead of this gather facts. In fact, we can come down here and we can look at ansible.doc-l and look at cisco.ios, and we can see that we can use this iOS underscore facts module to collect facts. So I always set gather facts to false because it's just not useful for the network devices. But what I'm interested in for this playbook we're going to do is this iOS underscore command. So we're going to copy that, exit out of here, and we're going to do ansible-doc, and we're going to paste that iOS command in. So what we want to do is we're going to build our playbook. We're going to do the show version command, and we're going to copy this. So to build this task here, we need to create a tasks section, and then we're going to paste in this show command. Now, one of the nice things about working with Visual Studio Code is you can see the spacing is off. I just did a Shift-Alt, and I was able to select these 3 lines here, and now I'm able to 2 spaces, and now everything is sitting under the tasks file like it's supposed to be for a proper syntax. We can see that we have a task named run show version on remote devices. This is just a task name that'll display when we're running the task. We're going to use this iOS module called iOS underscore command, and we're going to run the command show version. And that's all we're going to do. We're going to tell this to run on both the NXOS and iOS device to see what happens and see what we get for output. We're going to go ahead and save it. We're going to come down here, and we are going to do our first Ansible playbook. We do that by doing Ansible-playbook. I'm going to do the -i here just to show you that it'll read the inventory. I know it's set to default, but this is how you would set it if you didn't have that thing set up with the Ansible config as your default. This is how you specify the inventory. I'm going to call our show underscore version.yaml. I'm going to do a -u, and I'm going to give it my username. I'm going to do -k, and that's going to specify that I want to provide a password for the device to SSH. You can put your password and your username into variables that can be called out for logging in. I don't. I like to specify the username and password just as good security practice. There are ways to put the passwords and things into a vault, but you still have to put a vault password in to actually extract those keys and things. So this is just how I like to do it. I like to do -u on the command line, give my username, and then have -k so I can do my password, which is going to come back and say enter my password. And if I've done everything right, we should connect, and it's saying, oh, its host is unknown because of the fingerprint, and it's probably because something is going on with this Ansible config here. Oh, I didn't save Ansible config. You can see this little white dot here indicating the file's not saved. That's my fault. So you can see that, again, because I didn't have the Ansible config set up, in fact, there are two things would have happened. If I hadn't set that -i for inventory.yaml, it would have never found an inventory to run against. But then I also didn't have it saved, so the host key checking was still enabled, and we found that the host keys are not there. So I'm going to log in now. It should ignore the fact that I don't have my host keys imported, and we see we're running show version on the devices. But we didn't actually get any output from the devices. We just says it ran the playbook. Well, if I hit the up arrow, how can I actually get some output from the device? Well, that's really easy. We could do -v, and that's going to give us a little extra verbosity on our playbook when it executes. And so now we can see that, wow, I got all this text coming back from my devices. And what's interesting is I'm using an iOS command, and it's working with NXOS. So, I said if you're mixing modules, it may not work. Well, it's, again, NXOS devices, iOS devices, some of the command sets are very similar. It's not to say that it won't work. You should be working towards making sure that you're using the right module for the right system that you're working with. So in this case, show version definitely works with the CAT-AKV, and it's also working with the NXOS device, even though that module is for iOS specifically. But this isn't really great. This is just a lot of text on the screen. This output's not great. If I come back up and I do 2 more V's, we're going to get a little more output. We're going to see a lot more things happening. But you see the output actually changes, so I get a little bit more organized output. So both of these things, these std out and the std out lines, were showing up in the last set of output. We can see std out lines here, and we should find std out somewhere in here. And I'm not seeing it, but I'm sure it's in here somewhere, just buried in all this line of text. But either way, both methods are not great. I really like to just get this standard outlines, output directly from the playbook. Why do I have to add -v to actually make that happen? Well, there's a way to make that work. If we come back to the playbook now, and here we say register, we are going to do version_output. And then I'm going to do another task, and I'm going to do debug. And I'm going to say var version_output. And we're going to do a dot, and we're going to say give me standard outlines. So std out _lines. So I'm saying register the output. Create a variable when you get output from these devices and put it in this version_output. Each host is going to create a variable called version_output for each host. When we debug the command, it's going to run this debug for version to output for each host, because it's created their, each one has created their own version_output variable. And part of that is standard outlines. When we have standard out, we have standard outlines. When I run it, we're going to see this output from both systems. So we're going to save that. We're going to come back. We're going to remove those V's. I'm going to log back in. And this time we'll see 2 tasks. We'll see the show version on remote devices. But now, without using the verbosity, we're actually getting output from the devices. So this is really cool. So now I've got debug output. I'm actually doing the show version. I'm getting some interesting output from both devices. It's clean. I don't have extraneous data. And that's it. That's how you show, version. That's how you run a command on device. But what if I want to get interface data? I got some management interface configuration on there. Let's go ahead and take a look at creating a new playbook just to show interface and see what happens with a different command and see what the results are. So let's take a look at that. And so what I want to do is come over here and I'm going to copy show version. I'm just going to come back. So I did copy. We're going to come back to show commands and I'm going to do a paste. And so we have this show version copy. I'm going to hit F2. On Windows, it's F2 to do our rename. On Mac, it's Enter. I'm not sure if it's the same on Linux. Just hit Enter. You can also right-click and do rename. But I'm going to change the show version to show interfaces. Or just do show interface. And so yeah, you can right-click and just do rename. You can see for me, I have F2. You can look and see what your rename is. So for this show interface, I'm actually going to do show IP interface brief, and I'm going to call this interface underscore output, and then we're just going to do interface output standard outline. So we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to do a different command. We want to do show IP interface brief, and we want to see the management interface configuration for both devices. So let's take a look at that with our playbook. So for this one, I'm going to do a new line. We're going to do Ansible playbook. I'm not going to use the -i to call out my inventory. I've already defined a default inventory. I'm just going to let the Ansible config run that. But now I'm going to do show interface.yaml, and I'm still going to do my username and password, so netadmin, and I'm going to enter the password in. So the playbook's going to run on both devices. We can see we got Cat AK Internet, and we got the NXOS. But there's some pretty interesting data here already. For the Cat AKV Internet, we see the output came back and it's showing us all the interfaces. This is a DHCP interface sitting in the default VRF. But when I set up Gig 8, I put it into a management VRF. So it's actually in a separate VRF on the host, and I'm still seeing it in my config. But down here on standard outlines for the Nexus 9KV, I'm only seeing this interface that's connected to Gig 2. Well, that's interesting. It's not showing my management interface. It's actually, Nexus has it in a different VRF. So how could I look at the VRF information for the Nexus? Well, I could just come over here, and Nexus allows me to do show IP interface brief, and I could say VRF management. But I don't know if that's actually a command on Cisco iOS. But it should be. They're pretty close to each other. This show IP interface brief worked. Let me see if I can just show that VRF management on both interfaces. So we'll go up. We'll hit the up arrow, and we'll see what happens. And we see immediately that Cat AKV Internet failed because it's not a valid command. It's invalid input, and it's picking it up right where I did VRF management. Well, the Nexus worked. I'm using an iOS module, so what's the result here? This is one of those things I was talking about earlier where there's just enough of a difference between how iOS works and how NXOS works. And if we were to log on to this iOS XE box, so we'll do that, we're going to find that this show IP interface brief VRF management is definitely not a command. So 172.16.1.101. We'll accept the fingerprint and we'll log in. And we'll do show IP interface brief VRF. And nothing. It's an unrecognized command. We show IP brief. We see the command, the outputs there that we saw before. Well, let's look at show and see what our options are. We see that there's a show VRF right here. So we got show VRF. And if I do show VRF, well, it's different. So iOS usually the VRF command comes before the right after the show command for the things you're going to do for certain features. And in this case, show virf doesn't show me anything. There's no show virf IP interface brief. There's no command that matches what we have on the nexus of the show IP interface brief virf management. So the way both iOS's, or I should say both operating systems, handle their configurations is different, and it's something to be aware of. I'm going to exit out of here. So how do we handle something like that? How do we handle where there's two different types of styles of commands that we need to run? And in this case, we really have two modules we need to run. We've come back to our show interface. We can do when, and what we say is when Ansible network OS is equivalent to iOS. What I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this virf management, and I'm going to take this and I'm going to apply it to my debug. And what I'm going to do is say, when you run this task for this iOS device, only run it when the network module matches, or the network OS matches iOS. So when you're looking at the inventory, make sure this variable is set to iOS. And what we should see now is if I run this command again, it's only going to run on one host. And we can see that it ran on the remote device, it gave me the output, but if we come down, we don't see any reference to the Nexus 9KV except in the play recap, where we see two skip devices. And now that's that show skip devices being set to false working and not showing it in this output. If I were to turn that off, we'd see skipped for the Nexus for both of these tasks. And again, it just, if you're doing a lot of devices, eventually clutters things up. But I need to get my Nexus output. How could I do that? Well, I'm going to take all of this and we're going to copy it. And what I'm going to do is, even though this command worked, I want to get this set up properly, and we're going to do NXOS underscore command. We're going to do the show IP interface brief still, but I'm going to do two things now. I'm going to do commands. I'm going to do a list of commands. I'm going to do show IP interface brief, and I want to do show IP interface brief virf management. So now I'm creating a list that's just unique to NXOS. I get all my interfaces information out of show IP interface brief on iOS XE, but for NXOS to get all the information I want to see, I need two commands. So we're going to do this list of commands, and we're going to change this Ansible Network OS to NXOS, and we're going to change this to NXOS. We're going to save it, and if I've done everything right, which I think I have, we should be able to run it, and we should be able to get the output from the devices. And we see that it ran that command. We got ETH11 showing up for our first line, so we can see that show IP interface brief ran. We can see that show IP brief virf management showed up directly after that. So now I get a list of both hosts, or both virfs, and their configuration, where I only need that one line to do the iOS device. To do NXOS, I need to do two lines, and that's how I would do it. I've separated it out so that the Nexus devices run when Nexus devices are called, the iOS devices run when iOS is called, and when I don't have things that match, either I skip them. So we skipped two tasks for each host, and you can see that we've only got one host here right now. If I had lots of iOS devices and a lot of NXOS devices, I'm kind of running playbooks between the two of them, you could get a lot of skipped hosts in your output. And real quick, just to show you, we'll switch this to true, this to true. Actually, I'm going to leave this false because I don't have the other key yet. But we'll display the skipped host, which is the default behavior. And we see it popped up that it was skipping the host, and then it did the cat AKV. It skipped again, and again, we're seeing the output. So you can see where if you had a lot of devices, this would quickly add up, and you'd see a lot of different output in here, and that's not desirable. So coming back to your configuration and turning this to false is definitely your best bet. And that kind of goes over doing some simple show commands. We haven't done any configuration here. We didn't get super crazy with output and doing things on the device, but This gives you kind of a starting point for how you manage your inventory, how you would show commands on the device, and gives you that starting point for pulling data and looking at the output with Ansible. It also gets you kind of into the thought process of thinking about, how you manage when you have iOS devices, how you manage NXOS devices, and like subtle differences you need to consider, where if you want to see all the output, you may need 2 commands to do it on a platform versus another one where you have 1. But you can get it all out of one playbook. I have this one playbook here. It's 28 lines, but it's only 4 tasks to achieve the same result to get all the information. So I hope this is helpful. This is a good starting point for some of the things we're going to do. We're going to talk a lot more about conditionals and where they come into play. We're going to look at, building this inventory out. We're going to have a whole lot more hosting here. I'm going to have more 8kV routers. We're going to have a couple more NXOS switches. And we're going to actually start doing some configuration. So for the next video, we may not add any more devices. I think we're going to kind of build on this setup that we have here, which is we've got this automation jump host. And we'll go and we will, get these interfaces configured. We'll actually do some configuration between here. So right now, we've got DHCP configured. We don't have this interface configured on the device, but we'll go ahead and we'll get that configured up, and we'll actually, show you how you configure the devices and get things added. But this will kind of be our starting point, and we may add more stuff to this as we go along. But I'll share this out as kind of the start point. I'll share all the labs out so that you have them available to you to look at. I hope this is a good starting point for you. I hope this is helpful. Let me know what feedback you have on things you want to see for configuration and things you'd like to explore as far as working with the different platforms. Thanks for watching the video.